November 2nd, 1941 6:12 a.m. Hillpoint, 302, northern France. The first light of dawn barely touched the ridge as Staff Sergeant Daniel Mercer pressed his cheek against the cold walnut stock of his rifle. A thin sheet of frost clung to the metal, and every breath he exhaled rolled across the scope like drifting smoke. He wiped it away with his glove, steady but tense. Far below, blurred figures moved between the hedgerows, 3 German scouts pushing upslope from nearly 300 yards. Mercer anchored his elbows into 2 sandbags, settling into the exact firing posture they drilled at Fort Benning, yet nothing about this ridge felt like training. His hands were stiff from the cold, his heartbeat thumped through the wooden stock, and in his grip was a rifle that, according to the manual and his captain, should not have been here at all. Just 2 nights earlier, the captain had slammed the armory ledger shut and barked, "Your rust lock trick is banned. Use it again and you'll crack the bolt housing." Mercer didn't argue. He never did. But he knew the truth that nobody in headquarters wanted to admit. The rifle's bolt froze when the temperature dropped, and the standard procedure tap, pull, align took 5 precious seconds. In a real firefight, 5 seconds wasn't procedure. It was death. A gust of wind rolled across the ridge, rattling the old bipod welded to the rifle's underside. The weapon looked almost ancient in the pale light pitted metal, worn bluing, tiny rust freckles around the bolt handle. The same flaws that made the officers hate it were the ones Mercer understood best. He had spent months tuning its quirks, learning the pressure points, the micro twist that freed a jammed bolt instantly. A trick born from desperation and cold mornings, not from the manual. Down the slope, the Germans had split one moving toward a fallen oak, another crawling behind a stone wall, the third lifting field glasses toward Mercer's position. The distance was closing. 280 yards, then 260. He slid his thumb across the bolt. It resisted, half frozen, half locked. Exactly what the captain warned about. Mercer breathed in. Frost bit the inside of his nose. He whispered to himself, barely audible, "No time for the manual. It is racked." Then, in one practiced motion, the one he wasn't supposed to use, he twisted the bolt 5 degrees off axis, snapped it backward, felt the rust shear loose, and slammed it forward until the chamber locked with a sharp, metallic clack. The rifle was alive again, and in the next 6 hours, that banned trick would help him stop 13 Germans from overrunning Hillpoint 302. A trick the army rejected, but the battlefield didn't. The cold November wind swept across Hillpoint 302 as Mercer kept his body pressed low behind the sandbags, listening to the gradual crunch of boots moving through the frost-coated hedgerows below his position. The dawn light was still weak, painting the field in muted gray tones that blurred distance and depth, forcing him to rely on instinct and the subtle shifts of movement at the edge of his vision. His rifle rested steady on the old bipod welded years ago, and the weight of the long barrel pulled slightly forward as he adjusted his breathing to control the rise and fall of the crosshairs. Every sound on the ridge carried farther than usual in the brittle morning air, allowing Mercer to hear the faint clicking of German gear snapping against belts and the low murmur of quiet commands drifting upward from somewhere beyond the tree line. He remained perfectly still, feeling the grain of the wooden stock against his cheek while he tracked the faint silhouette of the first scout as he moved between gaps in the hedges. The man advanced cautiously, stopping often, pausing to scan the ridge with a discipline that suggested experience and a clear understanding of the danger in open terrain. Mercer shifted slightly to the right, keeping his elbows anchored to maintain stability, and the movement caused a soft crackle of frost beneath his sleeve that sounded unnaturally loud in the otherwise still air. He tightened his finger on the trigger guard, not yet ready to fire, waiting for the moment when the scouts committed to climbing the final slope that offered no cover and placed them directly within his field of fire. His position on the ridge had been chosen for this exact reason, providing a clean downward angle and an unobstructed lane that widened as the enemy approached. A thin veil of fog drifted across the lower field, sliding slowly upward as the sun tried to break through the distant clouds, and Mercer felt the temperature shift slightly as the breeze changed direction. He exhaled carefully, watching the fog roll past the tip of his barrel, and recalibrated the range in his mind, estimating the nearest scout at just under 250 yards, close enough for a clean first shot if the wind remained steady. The second scout followed behind the first with a controlled pace, pausing to observe the ridge, while the third lingered near a fallen tree, raising binoculars slowly as he scanned toward Mercer's position. The binoculars caught a brief glint of weak sunlight, creating a small flash that disappeared instantly, yet the moment told Mercer everything he needed to know about their intent. The Germans were not probing randomly or wandering by accident. They were mapping the ridge carefully, searching for the exact firing nests they believed the Americans had established during the night. Mercer adjusted his shoulder, pressing the butt of the rifle deeper into the crease above his collarbone, feeling the familiar pressure point that allowed him to absorb recoil without shifting his sightline. A quiet vibration passed through the wooden platform beneath him as distant artillery rumbled toward the south, and the sound rolled across the ridge like a slow-moving wave, fading into the trees before dissolving entirely. Mercer used the fading echo as a timing cue, letting the residual noise mask the soft metal clicks as he reset his bolt and checked the tension with a subtle twist. The bolt resisted slightly, confirming the early stages of rust lock forming again, and he knew he would need to rely on his band technique the moment the rifle heated under sustained fire. The scouts were now advancing in a staggered formation that revealed their intention to secure the base of the hill before committing a larger force upward, and Mercer understood that the next 10 minutes would determine whether his position held long enough for reinforcements to arrive. He drew a slow breath, settling his weight evenly across the sandbags, and centered the crosshairs on the lead scout's chest as the man stepped into a clearing illuminated by the faint glow of early morning light. The ridge grew silent, the wind paused, and Mercer's world narrowed to a single steady point where movement meant necessity and hesitation meant death. The ridge trembled faintly as distant machine gun bursts echoed from the southern tree line, reminding Mercer that his platoon was already engaged, and that every second he held this position bought them a little more time to reorganize. The radio on his hip crackled intermittently with clipped transmissions, each one carrying the edge of panic as scattered squads reported shifting German movements that suggested a coordinated push toward the hill from multiple directions. Mercer listened while keeping his eye fixed through the scope, absorbing the tension in every rushed message as voices overlapped and commanders tried to impose order on a battlefield that was beginning to slide out of their grasp. A sharp call came through the static, warning that the unit at the base of the slope had taken casualties and was falling back under heavy pressure. And Mercer understood instantly that the ridge was no longer a vantage point, but the last stable anchor, preventing the line from collapsing entirely. He heard boots scrambling on loose soil somewhere behind him, followed by a medic shouting for another pair of hands as he dragged a wounded private toward a makeshift shelter dug into the rear embankment. The sounds blended into a chaotic rhythm, metal clattering, men shouting, gear rattling, and each noise reached Mercer even through the cold concentration required to steady his rifle. He lowered his head slightly as a stray round clanged against the metal plate, reinforcing the side of the nest, showering his sleeve with splinters of rust and dirt, and the near miss confirmed that German marksmen had started probing the ridge from an unseen flank. The pressure built with every heartbeat, pushing against Mercer's focus like a tightening vice, yet he kept his breathing measured while adjusting his firing angle to track the shifting movement of the scouts, who were now closing the distance with growing confidence. Behind him, an exhausted corporal scrambled up the incline, cursing under his breath as he tried to warn Mercer that the forward squad had lost 2 men and was struggling to hold the line long enough to retreat safely. Mercer nodded without looking back, sensing the desperation in the corporal's voice, and the truth settled heavily on his shoulders. The ridge had effectively become the hinge on which the entire defense now swung, and any hesitation from him would leave the lower units exposed. The corporal slid down the slope again, yelling orders for the retreating soldiers to pull ammunition crates higher, and the thud of wooden boxes hitting the ground blended with the distant rumble of German mortar crews adjusting their aim. Mercer pressed deeper into the sandbags, aware that the enemy scouts below were likely feeding targeting coordinates to units, preparing to strike the ridge with overwhelming force. A short, broken plea crackled over the radio, followed by the unmistakable sound of a sergeant shouting for smoke cover as his squad attempted a desperate reposition, and Mercer felt the urgency of the moment settle into a calm, focused clarity. The battlefield around him pulsed with frantic motion, yet his role demanded stillness, one man holding a thin line, while dozens relied on his ability to delay, disrupt, and deny the enemy's climb up the slope. He shifted his weight slightly to relieve the pressure building in his elbow, then realigned the crosshairs on the advancing scouts, whose pace had quickened as they sensed the disarray in the American defense below. The wind carried the scent of burned cordite and churned soil, drifting past Mercer's position, like a bleak reminder of the mounting cost of the fight. He could hear men coughing behind him, struggling to regroup while clutching rifles still hot from earlier exchanges, and their strained voices whispered the kind of fear that came only when soldiers recognized they were being pushed harder than expected. Mercer absorbed their fear without letting it disturb his aim, understanding that stopping the scouts was the first step in preventing the larger force from overwhelming the hill entirely. A sudden shout erupted from the lower tree line as another American position fell back under a hail of German fire, and the chaos surged again across the ridge, breaking against Mercer's resolve like waves crashing on rock. He felt the ridge tighten around him, men moving, commanders yelling, bullets whining overhead, yet through the turbulent noise he sensed a familiar rhythm returning, the same rhythm he had learned in training, when everything depended on one clear shot delivered at exactly the right moment. The scouts edged closer, unaware of the turmoil unfolding above them, and Mercer steadied his finger on the trigger, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether the entire ridge held or shattered under the growing weight of the German assault. The rising tension across the ridge reminded Mercer of the rigid procedures drilled into him at Fort Benning, where instructors insisted that every rifle malfunction had a precise and carefully engineered response, designed to eliminate human error through repetition and discipline. The training manual emphasized that a soldier must maintain absolute consistency in clearing jams, beginning with a slow pull to confirm chamber obstruction, followed by a straight-line bolt stroke executed with moderate force to avoid stressing the receiver under combat conditions. He recalled the instructors pacing behind the firing line, barking reminders that the proper sequence prevented catastrophic failures and ensured reliability in harsh environments, even though none of them had ever demonstrated the procedure under live fire with freezing wind and encroaching enemy scouts. The regulations were engraved into his memory with almost ceremonial formality, and each step carried a sense of doctrinal certainty that left no room for improvisation or deviation, especially when dealing with older rifles inherited from early war stocks. According to the manual, a misaligned bolt stroke could fracture the housing, damage the locking lugs, or, in extreme cases, cause the weapon to misfire dangerously close to the shooter's face. Those warnings had been repeated endlessly during training, with instructors lifting damaged parts from wooden crates, as grim reminders of what happened when soldiers tried shortcuts that had not been approved by ordnance engineers. Mercer understood their caution, yet he also knew that the scenarios described in the manual assumed stable firing ranges and ideal temperatures, not a wind-swept ridge in northern France, where frost crept into every groove of exposed steel. As the scouts advanced below, he remembered the specific wording printed in bold lettering beneath the maintenance diagrams. In cold conditions, apply oil sparingly to prevent freezing. Never force the bolt under resistance. That sentence echoed through his mind each time he felt the subtle stiffness beneath his fingers, and he could almost hear his captain repeating the same doctrine with stern authority, reminding him that forcing a frozen bolt could render the rifle unreliable or even hazardous. The captain had made his position unmistakably clear 3 nights earlier when he drilled the platoon on winter operations, insisting that soldiers must follow standard procedures under all circumstances, regardless of terrain, fatigue, or urgency. Yet Mercer also knew the manual did not account for the cumulative effects of frost, mud, and rapid temperature shifts that plagued rifles left exposed during long night watches, especially on elevated positions where the cold settled hardest. The polished diagrams showing smooth mechanical operations never mentioned the grinding friction he felt each morning when the metal contracted and locked microscopic rust flakes into the bolt channel. Nor did they address the way adrenaline altered fine motor control during prolonged engagements, making delicate, slow movements nearly impossible when bullets snapped past at unpredictable intervals. Behind him, he heard another burst of chaotic radio traffic, as a squad leader requested fire support that simply wasn't available, and the futility of relying on perfectly scripted techniques in such circumstances pressed heavily on Mercer's thoughts. The training manual's expectations felt increasingly abstract as the ridge descended into disorder, with wounded men being hauled toward makeshift shelters and retreating squads, trying desperately to organize a defensive line without exposing themselves to the advancing enemy. He felt the weight of doctrine pulling against the reality unfolding around him, each one demanding a different response to the same imminent danger. Mercer shifted his grip slightly, acknowledging that the official procedure offered a safe, predictable approach in environments where variables could be controlled, yet combat rarely afforded such luxury. He knew he could attempt the measured, textbook-approved bolt stroke, but he also understood that the rifle's growing stiffness would require several seconds of precise manipulation, and those seconds might allow the scouts to close the distance and signal for heavier units to advance. The manual offered clarity in theory, but it had no answer for a battlefield where necessity eclipsed regulation and improvisation became the only path to survival. As the first scout reached a narrow clearing that exposed his entire profile, Mercer felt the cold metal tighten again under his thumb, confirming the early signs of another rust lock forming. He held his breath for a moment, weighing the procedure he had been ordered to follow against the instinct honed by nights spent repairing rifles under dim lantern light. The ridge trembled with distant artillery, the radio crackled in distress, and the manual's clean diagrams faded from his thoughts, replaced by the raw urgency of the moment. The scouts were closing in, the line was faltering, and Mercer knew that strict adherence to doctrine would not hold the hill for even one more minute. The longer Mercer held the ridge, the more the flaws in the official procedure revealed themselves, exposing the gap between the manual's idealized battlefield and the brutal reality unfolding only a few yards beneath his boots. The crisp diagrams and confident technical notes assumed a stable rifle maintained under laboratory conditions, yet the weapon resting in Mercer's hands had endured freezing nights, muddy patrol routes, and constant exposure to damp wind that seeped into every crevice of its aging steel frame. Each hour spent on the hill deepened the frost inside the bolt channel, allowing rust flakes to fuse with condensed moisture until the metal responded more like a stubborn hinge than a precision-engineered assembly designed for smooth operation. He felt these limitations clearly each time he attempted the standard bolt stroke, noticing how the cold amplified every microscopic imperfection that had accumulated over months of frontline use, transforming what should have been a swift, clean pull into a grinding contest between man and machinery. The manual never acknowledged that rifles on exposed ridgelines absorbed cold differently from those stored in covered trenches, or that temperature drops before dawn could freeze oil into a sluggish film that resisted pressure with surprising resilience. It also ignored the way mud splattered during nighttime skirmishes could dry into thin layers that behaved like abrasive grit, subtly altering the geometry of the bolt's travel until each movement felt hesitant and unpredictable. Behind Mercer, another short burst of chaotic gunfire echoed from the lower slope, reminding him that the battle unfolding around him had neither the patience nor the precision assumed by the manual's polished instructions. He knew that any attempt to follow the slow, deliberate clearance routine would require him to lift his cheek from the stock, reposition his hands, and momentarily break sight of the advancing scouts who were now only minutes from reaching the base of the incline. Even a minor delay risked allowing the enemy to secure a vantage point from which they could direct mortar fire onto the ridge, turning his defensive nest into a death trap with no escape route. The manual's insistence on gentle, perfectly aligned movements also failed to consider how adrenaline distorted motor control in moments of intense pressure, tightening muscles and shortening breath until fine manipulations became nearly impossible. Mercer had seen this firsthand during earlier skirmishes, watching inexperienced soldiers fumble procedures they had executed flawlessly during training, simply because the chaotic noise of battle scrambled their rhythm and robbed them of the delicate precision required by official doctrine. In contrast, the rustlock trick he had learned relied on larger, more decisive motions that felt natural under stress, allowing instinct to guide the movement rather than requiring perfect composure in conditions where composure was rarely available. He pressed his shoulder deeper into the stock, aware that each passing second increased the stiffness of the bolt, making the official method even more impractical as the weapon cooled. Frost glittered along the receiver like a thin sheet of powdered glass, discoloring the metal with a pale sheen that signaled deeper freezing within the internal channels. The training manual warned about cold weather malfunctions, yet offered no meaningful adaptation for moments when a soldier could not pause to warm the mechanism or apply fresh oil while under direct threat. Mercer understood now, with a clarity he had never felt during training, that the manual assumed time, a luxury that combat rarely provided. A distant explosion rumbled through the valley, shaking loose a thin shower of dirt from the ridge wall, and reminding Mercer that artillery could begin targeting his position the instant the scouts radioed the hill's defenses. He adjusted his firing angle again, feeling the bolt hesitate as he cycled it forward, and realized that following official procedure under these conditions might cost him not only his position, but the lives of the men still relying on the ridge to hold. The manual preached safety and consistency, Yet the battlefield demanded immediacy and adaptability, forcing Mercer to confront the stark reality that doctrine built for control could not survive the disorder of real combat. As he settled back into his firing stance, the cold tightening inside the bolt felt like a final confirmation that the prescribed routine simply did not belong on a ridge, surrounded by escalating danger. The scouts were advancing, the line behind him was fraying, and the weapon in his hands required a response the manual refused to acknowledge. Mercer inhaled slowly, accepting that the official method had failed him long before the enemy reached his sights, and he prepared himself for the moment when relying on band knowledge would become the only path left to keep the hill from collapsing entirely. Mercer first learned the rust lock trick long before the ridge at Hillpoint 302 became a battlefield, back when he was still a quiet young corporal, spending long nights in the cramped maintenance shed behind Company B's barracks. The shed smelled of cold oil, damp canvas, and old iron, and its dim lantern light flickered constantly, casting wavering shadows across racks of rifles in various states of disrepair. Most soldiers avoided the place unless ordered, but Mercer often drifted there after evening drills, drawn by an instinctive fascination with the inner mechanics of the weapons they relied on to survive. It was in that dim, cluttered room that he met Sergeant Hollis, a grizzled armorer whose reputation balanced somewhere between eccentric genius and walking reprimand. Hollis treated rifles like living creatures, muttering at them under his breath and tapping their receivers with the same rhythmic patience a doctor might use examining a stubborn patient. He spent countless hours restoring battered weapons the Army would have otherwise discarded, insisting that every rifle carried a personality shaped by its history in the field. Mercer had approached him one night, seeking help with a particularly uncooperative bolt that stuck each time the rifle cooled, causing delays that frustrated him during cold weather exercises. Hollis examined the weapon with practiced eyes, rotating it slowly under the lantern as if deciphering a code hidden in the pitted metal. After a long silence, Hollis had shown Mercer the trick, not with dramatic flair or rebellious intent, but with the weary resignation of a man who knew frontline soldiers sometimes needed solutions that never appeared in official manuals. He explained that after enough frost exposure, micro-rust accumulated around the locking recesses, creating a subtle resistance that normal cleaning could not remove during extended operations. According to him, the standard procedure failed because it attempted to force the bolt straight through the resistance, which only deepened the binding and risked chipping the locking lugs. Instead, Hollis demonstrated a slight off-axis twist, combined with a sharp backward snap that broke the rust's grip without damaging the bolt assembly. Mercer remembered practicing the movement again and again under Hollis's watchful gaze, feeling the subtle click that indicated the rust bond had fractured properly, followed by the smooth glide of the bolt returning to its channel. Hollis warned him repeatedly that the technique required careful judgment and should never be performed with excessive force. Yet, he also made it clear that in freezing conditions, the method could mean the difference between a functional rifle and a useless piece of metal. The armorer spoke with a calm frankness that impressed Mercer, explaining that many field-tested tricks came from necessity rather than doctrine, born from moments when manuals failed to address the unpredictable chaos of real combat. The memory of Hollis leaning against the workbench, wiping metal shavings from his calloused hands, lingered vividly in Mercer's mind as he held the ridge. He recalled the older man's quiet frustration with ordnance officers who dismissed his insights, labeling them improper, unsafe, or unnecessary, despite the clear evidence of their usefulness during winter campaigns. Hollis had once been reprimanded for teaching the technique to another soldier, leading to a formal order banning its use within the company unless specifically authorized by command. The ban became gossip among the troops, treated as an amusing footnote in training, yet Hollis had only shaken his head and muttered that regulations meant little when frost and rust combined to choke a rifle at the worst possible moment. As Mercer lay behind the sandbags, he realized how deeply those late-night lessons had shaped his instincts, guiding his hands even as doctrine insisted he forget them. The cold wind scraped across the ridge, stiffening the metal with every passing minute, and the subtle tension forming inside the bolt felt exactly like the early signs Hollis had described years before. Mercer knew that the rust lock trick carried risks if applied recklessly, yet he also understood that abandoning it entirely would leave him helpless against an enemy closing steadily up the slope. He breathed slowly, adjusting his grip as the memory of Hollis's patient instruction aligned perfectly with the demands of the moment, reminding him that survival often depended on knowledge the manual refused to acknowledge. In that instant, The ridge, the cold, and the advancing scouts all seemed to converge into a single truth. The trick the army band had been taught to him not as a rebellion, but as a lifeline for soldiers trapped in unforgiving conditions. Mercer felt the weight of that knowledge settle into his fingers as he prepared for what came next, aware that every decision he made carried the echoes of a lesson forged in a forgotten maintenance shed and refined in the harsh reality of war. Mercer felt the ridge tightening around him as the scouts advanced with growing certainty, their movements synchronized with the confident precision of men who believed the slope ahead concealed nothing more than a few scattered defenders already losing cohesion. The tension in the air pressed heavily against his thoughts, urging him to commit to a decision he had avoided since the captain formally banned the rust lock trick and warned him that any future use could result in disciplinary action. Frost continued to creep across the rifle's receiver, forming delicate white veins that hinted at the deeper freezing occurring inside the bolt channel, and Mercer knew with absolute clarity that the weapon would soon become unreliable if he attempted to follow the manual's delicate procedures. He took a slow breath as he watched the lead scout step over a collapsed fence and raise his rifle toward the ridge, signaling the others to spread out and begin their cautious ascent. The motion carried a chilling confidence that suggested the Germans believed they held the advantage, and Mercer felt a familiar jolt of urgency surge through his chest as he realized how little time remained before they reached a firing angle that could endanger the entire defensive line. His fingers tightened around the stock, sensing the stiffened metal beneath the bolt, and the resistance confirmed that the rifle was seconds away from locking completely if he didn't act decisively. The memory of Sergeant Hollis demonstrating the trick flickered sharply through his mind, contrasting with the commanding officer's stern warning that improvisations had no place in a regulated battlefield where discipline was supposed to outrank instinct. Mercer understood why the army valued such structure, yet the ridge beneath him was not a classroom, and the chaos swelling around him left no room for the slow, meticulous movements demanded by official doctrine. He felt the conflict between duty and survival tightening around him like a vice, forcing him to weigh the consequences of defying orders against the immediate danger of becoming powerless at the worst possible moment. A sudden burst of gunfire from the lower slope broke his hesitation, sending fragments of soil spraying across his knuckles and reminding him that the battle was shifting rapidly toward the ridge. The radio crackled again with frantic voices reporting heavy pressure and thinning manpower, and Mercer realized he no longer had the luxury of choosing between regulation and necessity. He angled himself slightly behind the sandbags, bracing the rifle with a firm grip, and acknowledged inwardly that the time for debate had ended the moment the scouts began climbing the incline with practiced confidence. With a steadying breath, Mercer placed his thumb on the bolt handle and felt the cold, gritty resistance that signaled the onset of a rust lock, the exact scenario Hollis had prepared him for during those dim evenings in the maintenance shed. The official procedure drifted from his mind like a discarded idea, replaced by the memory of Hollis's calm voice explaining how a slight off-axis twist could break the rust grip without damaging the mechanism. Mercer rotated the bolt a few degrees, sensing the friction resist him with a stubborn stiffness, and then delivered the sharp, controlled snap that sent a faint metallic crack echoing through the receiver. The movement felt both forbidden and necessary, a violation of orders yet perfectly aligned with the demands of the moment, and the bolt slid back with a smoothness that contrasted dramatically with its earlier resistance. Mercer exhaled slowly, recognizing that he had crossed a line that could not be undone, but the restored mobility of the rifle affirmed that the choice had been unavoidable. He chambered around with practiced precision, the weapon now responding like a trusted extension of his own resolve, and shifted his focus entirely onto the scouts, who continued to advance up the slope. Behind him, the ridge buzzed with frantic activity as soldiers repositioned, medics shouted, and commanders struggled to stabilize an unraveling defense, all unaware that Mercer had just broken one of the company's strictest directives in order to keep them alive. He felt no pride in the action, only the sobering clarity that came from realizing survival sometimes required stepping outside the boundaries imposed by those far removed from the realities of combat. The scouts edged closer, their shapes becoming clearer through the scope, and Mercer tightened his grip, understanding that the moment for restraint had passed. As he prepared to fire, the cold wind shifted again, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of churned earth and burned powder, and Mercer recognized that the ridge had changed from a defensive position into a crucible, forcing him to trust his instincts above all else. The rustlock trick once dismissed as reckless improvisation, had now become the quiet pivot on which the next moments of the battle would turn, and Mercer embraced the weight of that responsibility as he steadied his aim and prepared to confront the advancing threat with a rifle restored by forbidden knowledge. The bolt's sudden freedom gave Mercer a brief surge of confidence, yet he knew the true test lay not in the initial release, but in whether the rifle could maintain smooth cycling once the fighting intensified. He kept his cheek firmly pressed to the stock as he eased the bolt forward again, feeling the subtle glide of metal moving cleanly along the channel where, moments earlier, stubborn resistance had threatened to immobilize the weapon entirely. The contrast between the two sensations highlighted the precise effectiveness of the rustlock trick, illustrating how a single motion outside regulation could restore functionality, the manual's procedures never managed under freezing field conditions. Mercer shifted his weight slightly, anchoring his elbows deeper into the sandbags while listening to the distant clatter of small arms fire drifting up from the base of the hill. The battlefield noise sharpened his focus, reminding him that any hesitation could allow the scouts to secure a firing position that would expose the entire ridge. He drew another slow breath, then cycled the bolt a second time, confirming that the mechanism responded without the grinding hesitation that had plagued him only minutes earlier. This smooth motion reassured him that the off-axis snap had broken through the internal frost layer, allowing the bolt's lugs to settle properly within their recesses and eliminating the binding friction responsible for the earlier jam. As the lead scout emerged from behind a boulder and began signaling to the others, Mercer positioned his finger along the trigger, ensuring that his breathing and the rifle's natural rise fell into a steady, predictable rhythm. He felt the faint tremor of his pulse through the stock, a reminder of the adrenaline coursing through him, yet the renewed responsiveness of the bolt reassured him that he could maintain rapid follow-up shots without risking another freeze. He fired a controlled round that cracked sharply across the ridge, the rifle recoiling firmly into his shoulder before settling back onto target with practiced familiarity. The bolt cycled backward cleanly when he pulled it with a fluid motion, the chamber ejecting the spent casing in a bright arc that glittered briefly in the morning light before disappearing into the frost-covered ground. Mercer immediately recognized that the restored smoothness would allow him to maintain sustained fire without sacrificing accuracy or rhythm, giving him a crucial advantage against a force that relied heavily on coordinated climbs and incremental advances. The clean extraction and rapid chambering reinforced what Hollis had taught him. The rustlock trick was less about brute force than about manipulating the mechanical tolerances in a way that exploited the metal's natural flex under sudden torque. Another scout moved into view, crouching low as he attempted to flank along a row of jagged rocks, and Mercer shifted his aim, feeling the rifle respond with an ease that seemed almost foreign compared to its earlier stiffness. He fired again, the recoil rolling through his shoulder with familiar weight, and cycled the bolt in one continuous motion that felt nearly frictionless. Each movement reinforced the growing certainty that he could now deliver the rapid, controlled shots required to break the enemy's approach, especially in conditions where hesitation or mechanical failure could shift the balance decisively against the defenders. The winter wind swept across the ridge, chilling the exposed metal and threatening to rebuild the frost inside the mechanism, yet the earlier snap had disrupted the primary accumulation points enough to prevent immediate relocking. Mercer felt this stability with each bolt cycle, recognizing how the internal surfaces now moved cleanly along paths briefly cleared by the sharp shock of the trick. He knew the effect was temporary and would weaken as the metal cooled further, but it granted him a vital window in which speed, accuracy, and mechanical reliability aligned in a fragile yet powerful equilibrium. Below him, the remaining scouts tightened their formation, attempting to advance with renewed caution after witnessing the precision of Mercer's earlier shots. He adjusted his firing stance, pressing deeper into the sandbags and aligning his sight picture with the next exposed movement, knowing he had only moments before the enemy regrouped and shifted tactics. With the bolt now functioning smoothly, he could maintain the tempo needed to disrupt their momentum, buying precious time for the disorganized units behind him to stabilize and prepare for the larger assault he knew would soon follow. As he chambered another round with a swift, confident motion, Mercer understood that the rustlock trick had become the linchpin of his defense, granting him the ability to deliver reliable firepower despite the freezing conditions that had nearly rendered his rifle useless. The forbidden technique, once dismissed as reckless improvisation, now functioned as an essential adaptation to the unforgiving environment and relentless enemy pressure threatening to overwhelm the ridge. He steadied his breath, tightened his grip, and prepared to unleash the sustained fire that the restored bolt would finally allow, fully aware that survival for everyone on the hill now hinged on his mastery of a method the army had sworn he should never use. The first shot echoed down the slope like a struck bell, and for a moment the entire hillside seemed to pause before the scouts reacted with sharp, instinctive movements that revealed their training and discipline. Mercer watched them scatter behind scattered patches of cover, noting the fluid precision of their transition from reconnaissance to combat posture, and he understood immediately that these were not inexperienced soldiers wandering into danger, but coordinated advance elements probing for weaknesses along the ridge. The cold wind carried their shouted commands upward, mixing with the distant crack of rifles from the lower tree line, where the American squads were still struggling to regroup under relentless pressure. He cycled the bolt again, relieved to feel the same decisive smoothness he had fought so hard to recover, and fired a second round that clipped a scout as he attempted to sprint between two jagged rocks. The man collapsed awkwardly into the frozen grass, and his companions immediately shifted their positions, using overlapping movement to inch closer to the incline with steady determination. Mercer steadied himself behind the sandbags, understanding that this incremental advance was only the beginning of a drawn-out fight that would test not just his marksmanship, but his ability to maintain mechanical reliability under worsening conditions. As minutes bled into the first hour, the skirmish intensified with a steady rhythm that forced Mercer to adapt continuously while conserving his energy and ammunition. Each time the scouts pushed forward, he responded with precise, controlled shots that slowed their advance but never completely halted it, forming a tense back-and-forth cadence that mirrored the rise and fall of the wind sweeping across the ridge. The cold deepened gradually, numbing his fingers despite the gloves wrapped tightly around them, and he felt the rifle grow heavier as frost accumulated in thin white layers along the barrel and bolt housing. Occasionally, the radio behind him crackled with frantic voices, reporting new breakthroughs along the lower defensive line, forcing Mercer to shift his attention momentarily, while maintaining visual contact with the scouts moving between patches of broken stone. Their determination did not wane, even as casualties mounted, and he sensed an unspoken resolve driving them to reach the ridge before American reinforcements could stabilize the collapsing sectors below. The enemy's discipline became increasingly apparent in their coordinated fire bursts, which forced Mercer to duck behind the sandbags whenever they concentrated their aim long enough to threaten his nest. By the second hour, the firefight had settled into a grueling rhythm of short engagements, separated by tense stretches of quiet, during which the Germans repositioned, while Mercer monitored their movement for signs of an impending push. His muscles ached from maintaining the same crouched posture, and the cold gnawed at his joints with a persistence that made each adjustment feel heavier than the last. Still, he refused to break concentration, knowing that even a brief lapse could allow the enemy to close within grenade range, turning his elevated position into a deadly trap with no escape. As the third hour began, heavier rifle fire erupted from the opposite side of the ridge, signaling that another German element had attempted to circle around in hopes of catching the defenders off guard. Mercer shifted slightly to monitor the new threat, though he remained committed to holding the front slope, where the scouts continued to advance steadily in small, disciplined groups. Their movements revealed a calculated approach designed to test his endurance, forcing him to expend energy and ammunition in exchanges that yielded no decisive pause in their pressure. The fourth hour arrived with a sudden escalation, as several scouts launched a coordinated push up the central incline, attempting to overwhelm Mercer's position through sheer momentum. He responded with rapid, controlled fire, relying on the restored reliability of the bolt to deliver successive shots that fractured the assault and forced the survivors to retreat behind the nearest boulders. The adrenaline of the moment sharpened his senses, allowing him to track subtle movements even through the drifting fog that had begun to thicken with the onset of early afternoon chill. Fatigue settled heavily on him by the fifth hour, dragging at his limbs as he cycled the bolt with increasing effort, yet he refused to surrender an inch of the ridge. The scouts had slowed their attacks, but their persistence remained palpable, each new attempt probing for signs that Mercer's endurance might finally give way. He took slow, measured breaths to maintain clarity, ignoring the ache in his shoulder where repeated recoil had formed a deep, throbbing bruise that pulsed with each shot he fired. As the sixth hour loomed, the hillside fell into an eerie quiet, broken only by the wind rustling through dead branches and the occasional distant crack of rifles far below. Mercer scanned the terrain with narrowed eyes, sensing that the enemy was preparing a final push, and adjusted his stance to prepare for whatever remained of their assault. When the movement finally came, it lacked the earlier coordination, revealing exhaustion and hesitation among the surviving scouts who attempted one last desperate climb toward the ridge before retreating under Mercer's unbroken fire. When the final echo faded into the valley, Mercer exhaled a long, shaky breath. Realizing he had held the ridge alone against an enemy determined enough to test every weakness in his position. The 6-hour siege had drained him completely, yet the line remained intact, preserved by a rifle revived through a technique the army had banned but the battlefield had demanded without apology. When the last scout finally slipped from sight and the ridge grew still, Mercer lowered his rifle slowly, allowing the tension that had tightened around his chest for hours to ease with a long, controlled exhale that tasted of cold iron and burned powder. The valley below, once alive with scattered movement and echoing gunfire, now lay quiet, except for faint groans carried by the wind from the distant tree line, where the retreating German elements regrouped after suffering far greater losses than they had anticipated. Mercer blinked hard against the sting of fatigue as he scanned the slope once more, counting the bodies sprawled across the incline in positions that traced the path of their determined advance. 13 enemy soldiers lay motionless along the hillside, marking each point where their push had faltered under the steady rhythm of his fire, and the stark finality of the number struck Mercer with a mix of disbelief and grim acceptance. He had not kept count during the chaos, yet seeing the silent markers of each engagement reminded him that his survival had hinged on decisions made in moments where hesitation could have changed everything. The weight of what he had done settled over him heavily, not with triumph or pride, but with the solemn clarity of a man who understood that necessity had shaped every shot he fired. Behind him, the ridge slowly came back to life as soldiers re-emerged from cover, calling out to one another in tired, uneven voices as they confirmed the end of the assault and assessed the damage inflicted during the prolonged siege. A medic hurried past Mercer, heading toward a wounded private lying near the rear trench, while a sergeant barked directions for fortifying the position before the Germans could attempt a renewed attack. Mercer listened distantly, still feeling the cold imprint of the rifle's stock against his cheek, as if the weapon had fused to him during the long hours of uninterrupted concentration. When he finally rose from the sandbags, his knees protested with sharp pain, and the numbness spreading through his fingers reminded him how long he had held the rifle in a fixed, unrelenting grip. The bolt, still functioning cleanly thanks to the forbidden trick, gleamed faintly beneath the frost, and Mercer realized how narrowly he had avoided total failure at a moment when the entire defensive line depended on him. The weapon looked weathered and exhausted, much like the man who carried it. Yet its reliability through the siege stood as undeniable proof of the technique the army had dismissed so readily. A lieutenant approached him cautiously, glancing from the bodies scattered down the slope to the battered rifle still resting in Mercer's hands, trying to reconcile the scale of the defense with the single marksman who had held the ridge. His expression shifted from disbelief to something more measured, and he asked quietly how Mercer had kept the weapon functioning under such extreme conditions, when others reported widespread bolt freezes across the line. Mercer answered with a simple shrug, unwilling to elaborate, knowing the truth would only invite scrutiny or reprimand, despite its clear effectiveness in preserving the position. The lieutenant lingered for a moment, studying him with a look that blended curiosity with reluctant respect, before offering a short nod and returning to oversee the reorganization of the battered units behind the ridge. Mercer remained where he stood, absorbing the quiet aftermath with a detached calm that bordered on exhaustion, recognizing that his actions had bought the platoon precious time to recover and prepare for whatever came next. The 6-hour defense, impossible by any standard measure, had succeeded against overwhelming odds because he trusted his instincts over doctrine, choosing survival over strict adherence to regulation. As he moved toward a sheltered corner of the ridge to rest his trembling legs, Mercer glanced one last time at the long incline now littered with evidence of the assault he had endured alone. Every lifeless shape represented a moment where the restored bolt had cycled when it should have frozen, a moment shaped by a technique the army had banned, yet the battlefield had embraced without hesitation. The realization settled within him with a steady certainty, sharpening his understanding of what the fight had demanded and what it had proven. The ridge still belonged to them, the line still held, and the men behind him were alive because a forbidden trick had turned a failing rifle into a lifeline when nothing else could. In that quiet moment, as the wind swept gently across the battered sandbags, Mercer accepted that the payoff for breaking protocol was not glory or acclaim, but the undeniable truth that unconventional knowledge had saved the hill when regulation alone would have left them overrun. When the defensive line finally stabilized and the immediate threat faded into the thickening afternoon haze, officers began moving up the ridge to survey the ground Mercer had held alone, their faces tightening as they absorbed the scale of the fight etched across the hillside. The scattered bodies, the churned frost, and the deep grooves carved into the dirt by repeated recoil all testified silently to the intensity of the 6-hour siege, revealing truths that no report could fully capture. Mercer stood off to the side, leaning quietly against a damaged supply crate while trying to steady his breathing, unwilling to draw attention, yet unable to disappear into the back